CBSE Board, Class 11, History, Chapter 3, Part 6, Audio by Renee Matthew. Next topic is the monks. Apart from the church, Christians devoted their life to another kind of organization, and some deeply devoted, sincere religious people chose to live an isolated life. Isolated life means devoid the pleasure of the world. They gave up the pleasures of the world and they decided to live a different life, a total isolated life which was devoted to the religion of Christianity, and that was completely different from the life of the clerics and the clergy who lived amongst people in towns and villages. The clergy always lived among the people in towns and villages. They were in charge of the churches. Monks were people who were learned and who studied a lot. They were totally different from the bishops also. They lived in religious communities which were called as abbeys or monasteries. And abbeys and monasteries were built far away from human habitation. It was in a region which was totally isolated from human habitation. They did not see people. They could not actually converse and communicate with a normal layman. They always had their own isolated and secluded life. Two of the well-known monasteries, which is still even there now, is Saint Benedict in Italy in 529, that was built in 529, and then Cluny in Burgundy in 910. The monks always took vows to remain in the abbey. They had to stay in the abbey according to the rule for the rest of their lives, and they always had to spend their life in prayer, study, and manual labor, like farming. Of course, they had to work for their living. They had to always pray and study. So their life was a bit strict compared to the other kind of life that was practiced by the clergies. So again and again this point is repeated. It was not like the priesthood. This life was open to both men and women. Of course, women couldn't become priests. But monks, of course, men could become monks and women became nuns. Alright, so it was a total life in devotion, in sincerity, and they always pledged, they vowed to actually study and work for the church. These are the two places, Saint Benedict in Italy, and here is Cluny in Burgundy. Two huge, magnificent monasteries where these monks lived. There were a few cases where the abbeys had single-sex communities. Like they had separate abbeys for men and women, except for a few cases where they had both in one abbey, but it was, of course, divided. They had a demarcation there. And just like how the priests and monks could not marry, the nuns also weren't allowed to marry. Now, there were small communities which had 10 or 20 men or women, very small communities. They started like that. They started from small communities. Monasteries started growing to bigger communities from 10 to 20 men or women. And they started growing to several hundred with large buildings and landed estates. So see how it started. It started as 10 or 20 women and then it started growing. Several hundreds were there with lot of buildings and landed estates. And of course, the monasteries had their own schools, colleges, hospitals, and libraries because they had to study. And after all, they were human beings, right? So estate and buildings were also there. And they also contributed to the development of arts. Of course, they had so much of passion towards art. There was a person called Abbess Hildegard and was a gifted musician and did much to develop the practice of community by singing prayers in church. This is a picture of Abbess Hildegard, who did so much, a gifted musician. From the 13th century, what happened is that there were a group of monks called the friars. They were a group of monks themselves, but a division is there among the monks also. They were called the friars. They chose not to be based in the monastery. They did not want to live in the monastery, but they wanted to move from place to place. and their vocation was to preach to the people from the Bible, from the scriptures, and live on charity. When they went from place to place, the people will give them something, and based on that or from that particular charity only they lived. So they were moving people, like the minstrels, they used to move from place to place preaching. Okay, but monks always lived in the monasteries. This is a great source that we have to see. In Benedictine monasteries, so there are monasteries of different origin and different styles. Now there are Benedictine monasteries. There was a manuscript, an original work with 73 chapters of rules. They had a lot of rules and laws which they had to follow. And if they violated even one rule, they'll be kicked out of the monastery. They'll be just exterminated and excommunicated. So all the monks had to follow these 73 chapters of rules for centuries. And here are some of the rules given here. Like all the 73 cannot be accommodated here on the page. So we have just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rules. And this is typical of the Benedictine monasteries. The first one, permission to speak should rarely be granted to monks. They should not even speak. Humility means obedience. You have to be humble, you have to obey everything that is being told. No monk should own private property. Idleness is the enemy of the soul. They could not sit idle. They could not sit simply. So friars and sisters should be occupied. They should always be engaged and occupied at certain times in manual labor and at fixed hours in sacred reading. So they had to work and also they had to read. So everybody was forced, every friar, every monk, every sister had to do so much of labor, and they had to devote themselves to reading also. The monastery will have to be laid. The layout of the monastery is in such a way that every necessity, all the basic necessities will be met within its bounds. Everything will be available within the monastery. Water will be there. Mill will be there. There will be a garden and also workshops. So they don't have to go outside to meet their needs. So these are some of the rules which is prevalent or which was prevalent in the Benedictine monasteries, and they had to follow all this without any violation. They had to simply follow it. Okay. So by the 14th century, what happened is that there was a growing uncertainty about the value and purpose of monasticism. So by the 14th century, people did not completely agree to the style of monasteries or to the purpose of monasticism, because there was no purpose, they said. And these two works that I'm going to mention now are very important, especially in English literature and people who study literature. One is in England, Langland's poem, Pious Plowman. It's a very famous work. It contrasted with the ease and luxury of the lives of some monks. Though the monks were not allowed to have private property, they had to always devote their life to prayer and reading. Some of them wanted easy life. Some of them wanted luxurious life. So that was actually contrasted. So that was actually debated by this person known as Langland in the 14th century in a work called Pious Plowman. It was a poem. Okay, and that is because he saw some of the monks living in luxury with the pure faith. He asked, what is pure faith? If pure faith is living in purity, then what is this ease and luxury? Okay, so he told that the plowmen, shepherds, and common laborers had more faith than the monks, because they were not living in luxury style. What is expected of the monks that was found in the common laborers. When the monks were expected to live simply, when the monks were expected to lead a simple life, these people, these laborers were expected to, or without expectation, they led a life which was of humility and faith and patience. That was the difference. So there was a contrast which was given between the life of the luxurious monks and the common laborers. Another work was that of Chaucer. Chaucer wrote the Canterbury Tales. He is known as the father of English literature, and he had comic portraits of so many people from those days. He lived in the 14th century and his work became very important. One of the first works in English literature, all these works. And he gave a very comic but thought-provoking portraits of nuns, monks and friars, especially in the Canterbury Tales. So when we read that, we will understand how the society is, how the society in those days were divided. So it was a comic portrayal in those days. Now we need to look at the church and the society. Most of the Europeans became Christians, and they still had a hold over magic and folk traditions, because when you believe in Christianity, it is not absolutely right to have a belief in magic and folk tradition. But some of them could not do away with these beliefs. So, what was the belief of Christianity? Christmas and Easter was very important, and it became dates from the 4th century, very important dates. Even now it is followed. As you know, 25th December is celebrated as the birth of Jesus Christ, and it replaced an old pre-Roman festival. There was a festival in the pre-Roman times which was calculated by the solar calendar. Okay, so apart from that, they declared that 25th December is the birth of Jesus Christ. They did not follow that. It was totally different from the calculation that was done in the solar calendar. You should remember that. It is totally different. And of course, Easter marked the crucifixion of Christ, the passion of Christ, and also his rising from the dead. But this date was not a fixed one, because every time after the Good Friday, it keeps on changing. Only Christmas had a fixed date. And this also replaced an older festival to celebrate the coming of spring after a long winter. So when spring came, that was when the resurrection took place. So it did not have a fixed date, and it was dated by the lunar calendar. So Christmas was actually dated previously by the solar calendar, and that got changed. And now this particular crucifixion of Christ was replaced by the new calendar, and the lunar calendar was actually replaced. So that is the difference, and you have to keep these 2 points in mind. The solar calendar and the lunar calendar. So what did people do traditionally on that particular day? They used to, the people from each village used to make a tour of their village land, just like how they do now. They used to go to their previous village lands. With the coming of Christianity, they continued to do this. They called the village the parish because it was under one particular church. It was called a parish. Even now in church, when you have a community under one particular denomination, you will have one denomination in church, for example, but there will be branches in that particular church itself. And now it is divided according to the areas. So there, when they lived in the manorial estate, one particular village was known as a parish. And that came under the supervision of one priest. So one priest will be given one parish, and he had to maybe take care of 20 to 50 families. It was like that. And the peasants always overworked. They were laborious. And they always welcomed holy days as holidays. All these holy days were really holidays for them, because they did not have to work for those 2 days on the field, because they were not expected to work then. They had holidays. So look at the kind of pun on that word. And in those days, they were expected to pray, but people usually spend a good part of their time in having fun and feasting. They used to go to their village lands, and they will actually enjoy the 2 days. Just one day, like one day in Christmas and one day in Easter, for Easter. So that was a time that they always awaited. It's like the peasants and everybody used to await this day. And pilgrimage was a very important part of a Christian life, and that is what is shown in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, where everybody goes for a pilgrimage. It was a very important part of Christian's life, and many people vowed to go for long journeys, especially to shrines of martyrs or to big churches. They used to make travels like this, and during the travel they had good times. They used to have fun, and such were the findings and things which happened in those days. Now we need to look at the third order, which is peasants, free and unfree. Look at the title, very important point. Peasants, free and unfree. There are 2 divisions even in the third order. This is peasants, and the other division is the serf. Can you see that? Peasants and serf. We have to look into the vast majority of people. The third order, that is peasants and serfs, formed the majority of the people, and without the peasants and the serfs, the first 2 orders could not be sustained. Do you understand the meaning of that? Suppose the peasants and serfs stop working, what will happen? Everybody will go hungry. The clergymen, the nobles, bishops, everybody. King also will go hungry. So two types of cultivators were there. Both of them had a laborious kind of work. Both of their lives were not good. But the cultivators, the style of living that they had was totally different from each other. Okay, they had a segregation in that way. So we have the free peasants, and it comes from free peasants and serfs. It comes from the verb to serve. That is why they are known as serfs. They always have to serve in their life. Okay, so look at the meaning of the word. Peasants had a slightly different life from the serfs, and peasants had a slightly better life than the serf also. That is what you have to keep in mind. So in the next audio, we will look into the detail of all these 4 points. Alright?